Today's daf we're going to be learning is Sotah daf kafet. Today's daf is sponsored by Diane Kusher in loving memory of her father, Moshe ben Avraham, and her husband, Dennis, Shimon Avraham ben Yisrael Moshe. Find myself midway between the two recites of the most significant men in my life, my dad and my Dennis. Dad would have been so proud of my learning, and Dennis was very proud. I still can't believe he is gone. Okay, we are going to get started with our daf. If you remember, we're in the middle of trying to understand Rabbi Yehoshua's statement. Rabbi Yehoshua makes a statement in the Mishna, and he says, we talked about the woman with this, she always prefers the kav of tiflut from tisha kabinu prishut. And from there, he gets off on these different types of people who are prushim, basically. So we have, or like prushim, which we're going to talk about today, what exactly that is. So he said the following. Hasid shoter rasha arum isha prusha makot perushim haaretz mevalei olam. These are people who cause the slow deterioration of the world. So what are they? We have a hasid shoter. We said that was someone who sees a woman drowning and says, oh, I can't help save her because, I'll have to look at a woman. That's a hasid shoter, trying to make himself. Now, the common denominator between all these people really, or most of them, is that they look one way on the outside, but they're really something else on the inside, right? Someone who's not going to save a woman because, he looks so righteous, so can't look at a woman. That's someone who has something obviously wrong, is doing the wrong thing. Rasha Arum, we saw 7 different interpretations. Where we ended, we're now in the middle, or we're dealing with the very last one. So we ended with Ula, who really was at the top of our daf, which is Zeh shekara v'shana v'lo shimesh talmidei chachamim. He learns Torah, he learns Mishna, but he doesn't serve talmidei chachamim. The way this is really going to be meant to be understood is that to learn Torah and to learn mishnayot is, first of all, we're going to see later, they're going to talk about it as if it's like a parrot. They basically recite things without actually understanding what it is they're saying. And, right, the shimush of talmidei chachamim could mean one of 2 things, right? The usual way we mean is they don't serve talmidei chachamim, meaning maybe they're into their learning, but they don't have respect for the talmidei chachamim. But what it really seems to mean here is they don't also learn from the talmidei chachamim. So they basically recite. If you remember, there was this whole job, and we're going to talk about them today, of the people whose job it was, since they weren't writing down the mishnayot, it was all oral, their job was, we always have Tana kameh de Rabbi so-and-so. Came a Tana before. It doesn't mean they were a Tana. It means they were the ones who brought the Tanaitic material. They would recite. So those people who just recite and don't understand, and therefore they come to mistaken conclusions and maybe are teaching people things that are wrong. So that seems to be the issue here. Itmar. Now we have a statement. Itmar is always almost always an introduction to a debate between Amoraim. Now the debate here is possibly a halachic debate, possibly not a halachic debate. We'll first read it as if it isn't, and then we'll see that Rashi kind of pulled this to become a halachic debate, which is, how do we view these people? People always love to, even though we don't like this, categorize people. Oh, you belong in this category. You belong in that category, right? We always say, oh, that's not, right? We don't have to always categorize people, but people like to categorize things and people. So here we're going to have, into which category do you put these people? Rabbi Elazar amar, harei ze am haaretz. Oh, he's like another category of people that we know that are am haaretzim. What is an am haaretz? Well, we're actually going to see a number of debates about what makes someone an am haaretz, but in general terms, if you remember, we've seen this many times. There's the chaverim, they're kind of the ones on the inside, they're the learned people. And then we have the am haaretz, who generally aren't learned, they're not learning Torah, and they don't really keep halachot in the same way that the chaverim do. And they're suspicious, we suspect them of a bunch of different things. So one of them, for example, that they don't take masrot. So they might take truma, give to the kohen, but they don't take the maser, and then therefore you can't eat their fruits and vegetables without doing the masrot on it. So he says, these people who, because they're like am haaretzim, because they don't really understand things properly. Rabbi Shimon bar Nachmani amar harei ze bor. They're even worse than am haaretz. A bor is a foolish person, someone who's an am haaretz, but not only do they not learn Torah, but they don't really have understanding of anything. Rabbi Yanai omer harei ze kuti. They're like the kutim. Remember, they're the Shomronim who took upon Judaism because the lions were coming to attack them after the Assyrians moved them into Shomron, into the capital of the Jews, and the Jews got moved out to somewhere else, to Assyria. And the lions started attacking them, and they said, well, we need to learn the lessons of the land. And they found a Kohen who taught them how to be Jewish. And there's a whole debate. Are they real Jews? Are they not really converts because they just converted out of fear? Maybe that wouldn't work. It's called Gerei Arayot. And in general, they were known to not keep all the halachot, and often they also just didn't really keep with the traditions of the rabbis. So that are they like those people? Now, it makes sense to put them like those people because they really believe more in Torah B'chtav and not Torah Sheba'al Peh. And that would be the same as learning the Torah without having the traditions of the rabbis. Rav Acha bar Yaakov amar harei ze magosh. Magosh, often understood to be these Zoroastrian priests who often were involved in sorcery and things like that. And Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak mistaber ke Rav Acha bar Yaakov. Seems like he's got it right. Why? Da'amrei hinashe ratin magosh v'lo yada ma'amar. What's with the magosh? Someone who's a sorcerer, what do? They have incantations. And they say these mumbo-jumbo words that they really have no idea what they're saying. And, they hope it works, but they're just reciting mumbo-jumbo, which is exactly Amar, Tane Tana v'lo yada ma'amar. The Tana, the person who's reciting this Tanaitic material, he's reciting it like these sorcerers recite their incantations, and they have no idea what they're talking about. So there you have this sugya, which again, what's the importance of putting them into these categories? Maybe there is no importance, and it's just trying to connect things in our head. Oh, let's see what exactly is the big issue here. Is it that they're totally not knowledgeable? Is it that they seem to be saying things that they think they know what they're talking about, but they really have no idea what they're talking about? And maybe it could be damaging, like the sorcerer who can damage people with those incantations. Rashi tries to put a halachic spin on it, which again, I don't say this is the only way to read the sugya, but he says, well, haaretz shechashud ala ma'asrot v'ala ta'arot. Haaretz who know not to give the tithes, and they're also known not to keep tum and tara the way we do. So if you have a person like this who's reads the Torah and knows the mishnayot but doesn't understand them, well, then you have to be concerned that he's not taking maaser, and you have to be concerned that he's not careful about tum and tara. Right now, it seems like a random connection, but Bor, he just says garua me'ama aretz. He doesn't really say. He just says it's worse. Kuti asur lechol pito v'yeno. Even though they were converts, they weren't treated as full converts, and therefore the world laws for them were like Gentiles. You can't eat their bread, you can't drink their wine. So this would be the same, which would be interesting to say, that you couldn't drink the wine or eat the bread of someone who learns but doesn't understand what they're learning, right? Magosh, mechashef, okay, then he doesn't really say this halachic. I don't think he says anything halachic there. Anyway, so Rashi tries to say that some of these, you could take some halachot out of this about what we would suspect this person and what we wouldn't be able to do with them. Since we talked about Abaye and Rava, so now Tanu Rabbanan is haaretz. Who is an Abaye and Rava? How do you know? Rabbi Meir says, anyone who doesn't read Shema in the morning and the night with its brachot, okay, it doesn't mean, you could read this in two ways. It could mean you read Shema, but not with the brachot. But that's not the way it's taken to mean. It means someone doesn't say Shema in the morning and evening, but, with or without the brachot. Some people even take out the word bibirchoteha and don't even have that. So basically, it's affirming your belief in God in the morning and then in the evening, and someone who doesn't do that is an Abaye and Rava. If you don't wear tefillin, that makes you an Abaye and Rava. You have a four-corner garment and you don't put tzitzit on it. Rabbi Yonatan ben Yosef Omer, if you have children and you don't teach them to learn Torah, right, which is a way of passing down the tradition. They're not interested in the tradition being passed down. Others say, which actually is strange because it's often Achirim is Rabbi Meir, but Rabbi Meir already appeared earlier in the Braita, so it doesn't seem like it would be Rabbi Meir here. But Achirim Omrim, afilu koreh v'shoneh v'lo shemesh talmidei chachamim zeu am haaretz. That's our case, right? So he adds that to the list, and now you know why it's here, because it's mentioned in the context of a different Braita. Now this Braita continues. Not only, so there's someone who learns Torah, recites mishnayot, but doesn't learn with the Talmidei Chachamim, so that's an haaretz. Kara velo shana. What if you only know Torah and you don't even know Mishna? You're worse than that. Harei ze bor, then you're worse than an haaretz. You're a bor. Lo kara velo shana. This obviously disagrees with the person who put the first person in the category of a bor earlier on the daf. Lo kara velo shana. What if you don't do any of those things? Alav katuv omer v'zarati et beit Yisrael ve'et beit Yehuda zera adam v'zera behema. There's a pasuk that says, right, I planted into the land of Israel people, humans, and animals, and the seeds of them to have more. And basically what it's saying is you're like the animals. You're not even a boor, a foolish person. You're even worse than that. You're like an animal if you don't even learn Torah. Okay, someone who doesn't even learn Torah, they're worse. They're like animals, which is interesting because we just had this whole sugya about the women. And it sees why they put women in a low place, because if women can't learn, then they're perceived as, this is the ideal, is someone who learns and someone who understands, and the women weren't even having access to that. Anyway, maybe it's a good reason why the women should have access, because anyone who doesn't is basically considered. And why are they like a behemah? Because what differentiates between animals and humans? The intellect, and it's not using your intellect at all. Yirei et Hashem b'ni v'melech v'im shonim al titara. Okay, this we're going to see, because the word shonim is going to be understood as tanaim, as those who recite, okay, the reciters. So first we're quoting this pasuk from Mishlei, and we're going to try to understand it. Yirei et Hashem b'ni, my son. In Mishlei it says, my son, you should fear God, and the king, v'melech, v'im shonim al titara. Okay, this is advice for your son, and you shouldn't mix with the shonim. What are shonim? So I'm Rabbi Yitzchak, elu sheshonim alachot. The word lishno is to do something twice. Mishna Torah, like the secondary to the Torah, comes from sheni, second. So to do it twice, elu, those who recite the mishnayot. That's why Mishna is from shonim, because they would recite them. That's how it got its name. Tana is taf and shin, switch in Aramaic. So in Hebrew, it would be shana. Okay, it comes from all this that was recited. These are people who recite the halachot, meaning, like we've been talking about, they just recite them like a parrot and they don't really understand what they're saying. To which the Gemara says, pshita. Obviously, that's what the pasuk means. What else could it mean? No, it could mean a lot of other things. But right now, the Gemara asks, isn't this obvious? So they say, no, it really could have meant something else. And therefore, he needed to tell you it doesn't mean that, it means this. Ma'u detema, you might have thought shonim b'chet. Might have been someone who repeatedly sins, because what does it mean? It means to repeat. So don't be with those who repeatedly sin. That would have been a much more simple reading of the verse. So you might have thought that, and therefore it tells you no. So why might you have thought Shoni B'chet? Like Rav Huna said, Da'ama Rav Huna, and we've seen this statement a few times before. If a person sins and continually sins, it becomes permitted to him. Now, every other time we've quoted this line, Gemara immediately questions, becomes permitted? What do you mean? A sin becomes permitted because you repeatedly do it? And they always answer, it feels to him like it's permitted, or to her like it's permitted. If you sin and you continually sin, it becomes, right, the first time you do a sin, it feels like, oh, I'm doing something wrong. But once you do it a second time, and right, this reminds us a little bit of the Sotah. You drink the water and you see nothing happens to you, you think, maybe this isn't so bad. And you do it a second time, and then you really see, this really isn't so bad. And it becomes part of what you're used to doing. And therefore, they say, right, you might have thought, keep away from those who repeatedly sin, because to them, bad things become looked at as if they're permitted. Tana, and therefore, kamashva, that's why Rabbi Yitzchak had to teach you, that's not what we're talking about. This pasuk is telling you, beware of those who repeat the mishnayot without really, or the halachot, without understanding what they're talking about. Tana, another braita. Hatanaim mivalei olam. It's a very strange line. The Tanaim, okay, we've been learning Tanaim for a long time. My Zoom dropped, sorry about that. Okay, so Tanaim mivalei olam. So there's a braita that says the Tanaim are mivalei olam. The Tanaim are those who destroy the world. So now, how could you possibly say the Tanaim destroy the world? Mivalei olam sakadata. How could that possibly be? By the way, the word mivalei comes from biloi, okay? I'll give you an example in modern Hebrew. When you rent an apartment, so there's a matter of who's responsible for what, and you're responsible generally as the renter for bilai tiv'i, right? General use of, that causes depreciation of, something starts getting bad because you use it. That's bilai. So mivalei olam seems to be like a slow destruction of the world. You slowly wear away the world bit by bit. So now, how could you say Tanaim or mivalei olam? There's no way, no how. Amar Ravina shemorim halacha mitoch mishnatam. What it means here by Tanaim is not Tanaim like Rabbi Meir or Rabbi Yehuda, the famous Tanaim that we know. No, it means people who teach halacha from learning Mishnah only. Again, it's the same idea of not fully understanding. Tanya nami hachi, another braita about this. about this bright. Rabbi Yehoshua said, what are these people who are mevalei olam? Halomi yashvei olam hem. They're people who settle the world. Shenemar halichot olam lo, right? We always say this is, right, the halachot are halichot olam lo. That's the way of the world. This brings peace to the world, all those things about learning. Ela shemorin halacha mitoch mishnah. He basically says the exact same thing. The way, right? Now, again, we're going to see all these categories of people later, and it seems, again, these are people who appear to people as if they know something and might use that appearance to try to teach people halacha and influence people when really they don't know a lot at all. They just memorize these things without really understanding what they mean. Isha prusha. Now we're getting to the other two cases of Rabbi Yehoshua that he talked about in the Mishna that are mevalei olam. So when isha prusha, Tanu Rabbanan, here's a bright explaining what an isha prusha is. Bitula selyanit, a virgin who prays all the time. Doesn't sound so bad. We'll talk about this in a minute. Almana shovavit, a widow who goes, now shovavit, there's many different interpretations, but we're going to see later they talk about a shivavute, which is a neighborhood. Seems like a woman who goes from neighborhood to neighborhood schmoozing with people. And Vekatan shelo kalu l'chadashav. This is the more strange one to say. Isha prusha is a child who, do you remember lo kalu l'chadashav? It means was born at 8 months and they didn't believe that child would ever survive. That's what an isha prusha is. Okay, that really doesn't make any sense. We're going to have to wait for the Gemara to explain that to us. So now we have these three categories. So what it seems to be this, now let's go into them a little bit more. This betulat salyanit is someone who prays kind of all day long. And she makes herself look like, now what really seems, and we're going to see this from the sugya in the continuation, they were worried about women who were involved in witchcraft. Now, this isn't to say that all women were involved in witchcraft, but they were saying, here are some signs of how to catch which women, because women who are involved in witchcraft, it's kind of, it's very secret. They're good at kind of appearing as if they're one way, and they're really doing these incantations and spells, and they're doing things. Obviously, they existed in their time, and we're going to see an example of a particular woman in today's sugya. There were individual women who did this. It's not to say all women were witches, but they were trying to avoid, how can we know? So they said these are signs. A woman who sits and prays all day. First of all, you're praying, you could be saying incantations, possibly, right? Nobody knows what you're saying. And Almanasha Vavit is walking around from place to place. Who knows what spells she's putting on people? She wanders all around. Anyway, unclear exactly why in this we're going to have to wait and see. To which the Gemara immediately says, Ini, really? That doesn't make any sense. And in fact, they say, Bahama Rabbi Yochanan, didn't Rabbi Yochanan say, we learn fear of sin, which is a good thing, from a virgin. And we learn kibul sachar me'almana. We learn how to get rewarded for things from this widow. So basically what he's saying is like what we're saying is what you're going to suspect every woman that she's a witch just because of appearances. Yirat chet mi betula, how so? And we're going to see that possibly you could explain that this is a betula who prays all the time. And the other one is an almana who goes from place to place. So, or maybe they're just a virgin and a widow, and we're just saying, you can't really suspect all these people because there are some of them that are very, we learn things from them. So Rabbi Yochanan says, Shamana hi betula denafla apa. I heard of this virgin that fell upon her face. That means she went and prayed. So we have this woman who's praying. V'ka'amra, and she said the following: Ribono shel olam, God, creator of the world, barata gan eden ubarata genom. You created Gan Eden and you created hell. Barata tzadikim ubarata reshaim. Created righteous people, you created evil people. Yihi ratzon shelo yikashlu bi bnei adam. I pray to you that people don't sin because of me. Right? Maybe she was a beautiful woman and she was worried people would have bad thoughts, and she didn't want people to sin on her account. So he said, we learned yirat chet from her. Look how yirat chet she was. That not only was she trying not to herself sin, she didn't want to cause other people to sin. Her prayers were of that nature. So how can you say betulat salyanit? We're suspicious of her and that she's causing the world to be destroyed? Hibul sachar me'almana. Where do we learn this? There was a woman who there was a beit knesset in her neighborhood. Every day she would go and pray. This is very interesting because if this happened historically, she would go pray in the Beit Midrash of Rabbi Yochanan. Think about it, right? You don't really imagine women in the Beit Midrash, and you don't really imagine women going to shul. And here she went to shul to the Beit Midrash of Rabbi Yochanan. There are, by the way, stories of women who go to shul in those days. So she went she would go to the shul to the Beit Midrash. She had a Beit Knesset in her neighborhood, but she decided she was going to walk farther and go to the Beit Midrash of Rabbi Yochanan to daven. Kol Yom Amar la. So he said to her, Biti, lo Beit Knesset b'sheva butech. Why are you coming all the way to me? Is there no shul in your community? Amar le, Rebbi, lo schar psiot yeshli. Don't I get rewarded for walking farther to shul? Now, some people say, what? She was looking for the reward? And we're going to talk about that later today. You're not supposed to learn for the reward. But it seems like she's saying, I wanted to make more effort for my mitzvah. I wanted to have a longer distance to get to shul in order to get rewarded for schar psiot. So, right, if you do a mitzvah and it takes you longer to do it, it takes more effort, you actually get more reward. So she said, I wanted to make it a more significant mitzvah by walking farther. So what do you see? Here's this woman who goes to different neighborhoods, right? And she gets rewarded for it. To which they answer, Kika Amar, Gon Yachani Bat Retivi. Period. So what do they mean? So it says, well, when I said they were Mevalei Olam, what I meant was like Yochani ben Retivi. That's what I meant. A woman like her. Who is she? We don't know. Well, we look at Rashi. And Rashi tells us a whole story about who this woman was. Where Rashi gets this from is a good question. I don't know the answer. Perhaps it was a tradition that everyone knew kind of who she was, which makes sense because the Gemara just kind of said it, and it got passed down about what's the story with this woman. And here, if you didn't believe me that we were worried about sorcery, here it comes very blatant. So look at Rashi, Kegon Yochanan bat Retivi. Almana machshefa haita. She was a widow who was a witch. Ukishemagia eit leidat isha. What would she do? A woman was about to give birth. She would put a spell on her that her baby wouldn't come out. Imagine yourself in this position, right? Pretty unpleasant after having given birth to my first child 2 full weeks late. I know how torturous that is. And after the woman's really, really struggling, the woman would show up on the scene, Yochani Hazot, would you like me? I'll go and pray for mercy for you. Ulai tishama tfilati, maybe my prayers will be answered. Holechet v'soteret shafeha, and she would go and undo her spell. V'havlad yotzei, and then the baby comes out, and she looks like a hero, right? She looks like she's got a direct connection to God. This is again the same thing. Someone who appears one way and underneath is really not that way. Now, how did this woman get caught? How did we know she was doing this? Well, one day she had a worker in her house. And she went to the house of the woman who had given birth. So she left the witchcraft going, the sorcery, and he heard this thing going, that they were kind of making this noise circling around in the vessel. Just like the fetus was kicking around in the body in the womb of the mother. He opens it up to see what's going on in here. And basically the evil stuff comes out of there. The child is born, and then and then everyone was on to her. So basically, that's what they're referring to, this woman like that. That's what we mean by a betula who's praying all the time, and by this almana who goes from place to place. My katan shelo kalu lo chadasha. But what is this katan who hasn't reached their years yet? Their months to him, meaning, he's born at 8 months and he's not going to make it. Hachatirgumu, here in Babylonia, they explained, this is a tamid chacham that could be, there's different ways of understanding this. Leva'et really means to kick, literally. Could be to scorn his rabbis. He doesn't care what his rabbis say. He ignores them. Could be other things. Rabbi Abba Amar, Zeh tamid shelo higia lahora'ah umoreh. So now, by the way, why is it lo kalu lo chadashav? Because he's going to die young because of the things he does, because he scorns the rabbis. He's not going to live so long. Oh, thank you for asking. Why is this woman called a prusha? Okay, I didn't explain this term yet. It actually is going to come up much more in a minute, but thank you for reminding me. What does prusha mean? Let's talk about the translation of the word lifrosh. Lifrosh means to separate yourself. Now, separate is it's got those two meanings, because the word kadosh, what does it really mean? It means liot, separate, right? To be different from everybody, like the Nazir, right? He's separate and holy because of his separateness. Again, we talked about it. It's exactly the problem with the Nazir. separateness is not always a good thing. It's not always, it depends why you're doing it and how you're doing it. And this is kind of a similar idea. So what we're talking here is someone who sets themselves aside as if they're a very sincere, pious person, and really they're not at all. So that's what we mean. They're separate, but in a negative way. Okay? So the separateness here, which could be perceived as positive, ends up really being negative. So now let's get back to this kalul chadasha. So one option is someone who pushes off what his rabbi said. Rabbi Abba Amar, this is someone who doesn't reach the age or the stage where they can really teach, and yet they start teaching, and they start teaching halachas that are wrong because they don't understand things. As he quoted in the name of Rav, my dichtiv ki rabim chalalim hipila v'atzumim kol harugeha. This is a pasuk of Mishnah, which is actually talking about a prostitute, and it says the rabim chalalim hipila. She brought the downfall of many, many people, and atzumim kol harugeha, and the people that she killed are masses. So ki rabim chalalim hipila zeh tamich chacham shelo higia lahora'ah umoreh. So they say who brought a lot of people. They're going to say these are two different kinds of people, two different types of Talmidei Chachamim. One is a Talmid Chacham that didn't reach the age of teaching and taught. Taught doesn't necessarily mean being a teacher. It means teaching halacha, like paskening for people. Interesting. In that same vein, someone who does reach the stage of being able to teach and doesn't is also terrible. Okay, and causes the death of people. This is again the mivalei olam. So the kalul chadashav again is talking about people that bring about the destruction of the world because they eat, right? So kalul chadashav is kind of a baby that never made it. This is like a tamid chacham that never made it. Okay, there's something missing in what happened there. It's like a baby that's not going to survive. And the idea is that their days will be shortened. They'll be punished by dying young. Moving now to Amud Bet. Ve'ad kama. Well, now, if you're talking about what is higia lahora'ah, now they're assuming it's an age. So what age can you start teaching? This is like people say you shouldn't learn Kabbalah until you're a certain age. So also you shouldn't be a moreh halacha, a posek, until a certain age. What age is that? Or we'll talk about not necessarily age, ad 40 shnin, until 40 years. Now, this could mean until you're 40 years of age. It could mean until 40 years of learning. Now, that would be tricky if you say it that way, though, because I would imagine the average life cycle of a person in those days was 60. So if you start learning, let's say at 18, and then, right, 40 years later, you're going to be 58, you're going to be toward the end of your life already. So it's not going to give you a lot of years of teaching. Anyway, the Gemara already questions this and says, Ini, Vaha Rabba Ole. And Rabba, he was only 40 when he died. Actually, is it Rabba or Rava? Correct it. 1 second, I forget. Yeah, it should be Rava. Okay, Rava was 40 when he died, and by the way, how did I know that? Because there's an aleph next to Rabba, which goes to the Hagahot Tziyunim. My Gemara, that's what that's where it goes to, and it's an aleph there. Sometimes it's a little different what you have there. There's some marker there, and it says it should be Rava. Okay, so Rava taught halacha even though he died when he was 40. So it can't possibly be whichever way you define 40 wasn't 40. So what do they answer? Well, not everybody has to reach 40. If you're really worthy, like Rava was clearly, then you can teach at a younger age. So it's not only dependent on age, but with many people, it's dependent on age. Makot perushim. So that was all about the women, right? The isha prusha. And now we're going to get to what's makot perushim. To explain that, they're going to bring a braita, which talks about, and this is when I thought to define what a perushim are, but thank you for asking me earlier, because it was important to define earlier, but Tanu Rabbanan, Shiv'a Perushim Hein. Now, the assumption in our Gemara is that this braita, and I say specifically in our Gemara, because in the Yerushalmi, they understand their perushim could be good, could be bad, and the two last ones are going to be viewed as good ones. But in our Gemara, we're going to see they're all bad. They're people who separate themselves, again, in a negative way, and all of them are going to be, or most of them, again, appearing one way, but really being different. Parush Shichmi, we're not going to understand them yet, we're just going to list them. Parush Nikfi, Parush Kizai, Parush Meduchya, Parush Machovati Ve'esena, Parush Me'ava, Parush Me'yirah. Okay, let's start defining them. Parush Shichmi, Ze Ha'oseh Ma'aseh Shechem. What did Shechem do? They all kind of, did a Brit Milah, kind of convert to Judaism, but Shelo l'shem shamayim, Rashi says, they did it for their own self-benefit so that they'll be respected and all that. And it was all just an outside thing that really wasn't reflective of anything true inside. Perush nikfi, zeh hamankifet raglav. This is someone who walks, so there's many different interpretations. Rashi explains they walk with their head low, okay, which is trying to say, oh, I'm a very humble person. They walk very low, so low that they kind of move, they schlep their feet on the ground. All the interpretations, or almost all of them, are going to say that you have these wounds on your foot, and it's because you walk without picking up your feet, and therefore your feet rub against the rocks all the time. That's how Rashi explains it. Some people say you have bruised feet because your head is up in the sky. You're looking up like I'm very arrogant and I'm so great. And you make yourself look great and you trip on things and hurt your feet and you're really not so great. Another person explains that you have bruised feet because you claim my feet are all bruised because I walk to do mitzvot all the time. You kind of brag about yourself that, oh, I'm always doing mitzvot, so I'm walking all the time. And now because of that, my feet have blisters on them, etc. Okay. Some people say you actually pay on credit. And the word hakafa is to pay on credit. So that comes from nikfi, hakafa. And that you claim, you say, I need to borrow money now because I'm doing mitzvot. And again, you keep bragging, I'm doing mitzvot, and you're really not. Next, Parush kizai. Parush Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, and Amar Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, Zeh makiz dam lektalim. Now, most people say that this is the makot perushim. It's wounds of the one who's prushi, okay, who's a parush, which is someone who gets wounded. Okay, makiz dam is not, normally we think it's bloodletting. What it really means here is you bleed a lot because you bang into walls. Why do you bang into walls? So Rashi said, you claim you're so pious that you can't look at women and you close your eyes and you're walking on the street with your eyes closed and then you bump into walls and then you're bleeding all the time because you're bumping into walls. And again, you're just doing it for show. You're not really sincere. Parush beduchya, this is a little harder to understand. You're parush like a mortar. They would crush things. And a mortar, according to Rashi, it's bent. And it's like a person who bends their body, like we saw with the parush nikfi, and that you're kind of bent, looking low, kind of appearing like you're a great person, or very humble. That in that sense, great. Amar Rabbi Barshila, de mashpaki meduchya. So Rabbi Barshila says you're bent like the meduchya. Parush machovati ve'esena. So what does this mean? Hamal yutei. What does it mean? Machovati ve'esena. What am I obligated to do, and I will do it? That sounds kind of like now seven ishma, right? Tell me what I need to do, and I'll do it. That sounds like a great thing. Mal yutei. What do you mean that's a bad thing? Ela da'amar machovati tu ve'esena. It's all like in your tone and how you say it. What it means is someone who says, what more do I have to do? And let me know, meaning I've done everything I need to do and give me more, which no one does everything they need to do, right? That's bragging and it's not true. And again, it's the same idea. Parush me'ava, parush mi'yirah. So that seems to be someone who, again, according to our explanation, not the Yerushalmi's explanation, parush me'ava means someone who does mitzvot because they love getting rewarded. They do it just for the reward. And parush mi'yirah, they do it just because they're scared of God. So Amrule, Abaye and Rava letana. Abaye and Rava say to this Tana who brought this Braita, again, this idea that you're reciting things and you don't know what you're talking about. Lo titne parush me'ava parush mi'yirah. Get rid of that from your Braita, because Amarav Yehuda Amarav lo lam yasok adam b'torah mitzvot. Very, very famous line. It hasn't been famous enough. All the Gemaras we're learning about the women learning and all that. There's another very famous line in Sotah. Sotah is full of very known statements. La'olam yasok adam b'torah mitzvot. Person should always engross themselves in learning Torah and doing mitzvot, afilu shelo lishma, even not for the sake of heaven, even not for the right reasons, even not for, just to get a reward. It's fine. Why? Shemitoch shelo lishma ba lishma. Because even though you don't do it for the right reasons, you'll eventually do it for the right reasons. Kind of like the Sefer HaChinuch says, if you do actions, that will cause your heart to go with you. In other words, by doing things, eventually it will sink in, and then you'll eventually do it for the right reasons. So that's not true that you shouldn't do mitzvah, that's a bad thing. And that they're, people who destroy the world, no way, no how, that's actually viewed as a good thing. Okay, so here you have an interesting machloket, and if you listen to on second thought this week of Rabbanit Yafi Climber, she talks about this and brings other statements, some that seem to say this is a good thing, some that seem to say it's a bad thing. And what does it mean, lo lishma, lo lishma? It's also a very good question. What does that mean? What does it mean for the right reasons? What are the right reasons, right? It's very tricky to understand. So for more on that, you can listen to On Second Thought of this week. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Dimitamra mitamra, udimigalia migalia. What's people can hide their thoughts. That's mitamra. What's hidden is hidden. What's revealed is revealed. Migalia, migalia. But Beidina Rabba, but a Beitina Gadol, what's their job? Lihit para mehane dechafu gunde. They are supposed to exact justice on those who cover themselves. Chafu gunde, according to Rashi, they cover themselves with talitot. I don't know if they literally mean a talit, like we view a talit, but they cover themselves kind of like we've been talking about. Otherwise, some people have one of those interpretations for one of the earlier things about covering yourself with clothing to kind of, again, make yourself look very humble and very pious and that. So here we're talking about, and again, this is very, why do we keep talking about all these things? Well, this is what the Sotah is, right? She's doing something and we don't know what's going on inside. This is raising all of the complicated issues here, that we have no idea what really happened with this woman. It's secret. We have no way to reveal it. So the Beit Din's job is to try to reveal secrets. And in our case, in our Gemara, it's the Sotah water is supposed to do it because we don't have a way to really know the truth. It's struggling with this insincere piety and looking around and also concerned about women, right? Whether they thought that women were witches or they just thought that women were, could seduce men. Women have the power to seduce men, whether it's a woman's fault or the man's fault, right? It could be the man's fault that he was seduced by this woman, not by anything she did, but we know that it happens that men are seduced by women, or attracted to them and cause them to sin. So what we're worried here is the woman, a good, virtuous woman, or is she not? And we don't really know. And here's a whole sugya that's getting at all sorts of other people. It's not just the women. There's all sorts of people around in society that we don't really know what's on their inside and what's on their out. And that's our job to try to bring that out. And if you remember the whole Sotah ceremony, what's the purpose? And we'll get back to this again later today, which is the purpose is to try to get her to admit her sin, right? We don't really want her to drink the Sotah water. And that's why when I say the Sotah never happened, it's not that no one ever accused their wife of being a Sotah. It's very possible they did. But it never really got to the drinking of the water and the erasing of God's name because they tried everything they could to avoid it. And they're talking here about trying to figure out, maybe the Beit Din's job is to try to get it out before you get to that point. So there's a lot here that connects directly with our topic. Amalei Yanai Malka L'Debitu, last part of the section, Yanai HaMelech, who was a king from the time of the Hashmonaim, and he said to his wife before he died, he was at Stuki, and he had a lot of enemies among the Perushim, and when he was about to die, his wife was worried that when he died, they would all kind of take revenge on her and make sure that her son didn't continue to be king and perhaps kill them. So she said to her, he says to his wife, obviously as a response to something, her fears, prushin. Notice the word prushin. Now, prushin here means prushin stukim. Okay, the prushin, even though they're using the word prushi in a very negative way here, the prushin, as I said, they separated themselves. They kept Chuma and Tara on they kept their purity in a very high level. They treated themselves differently. This was like the rabbinic tradition. The people who went with the rabbinic tradition were called the prushin. He says, don't worry about the prushin, because they're good people. They're not going to kill you. Okay, they might be my enemies, but they're not going to kill you. Velomi mishenam prushim, and not from the Tzukim. I'm going by Rashi. She explains because the Tzukim are my buddies, right? That's who I align with. Ela min hatzvuim. You have to worry about the hypocrites. Shedomim leprushim. They're like the prushim. They make themselves look like the prushim. Shemasehem kemase zimri umevakshim sachar kepinchas. But their actions are like Zimri. If you remember the whole story of Pinchas ends up killing him because he goes with this prostitute. Umevakshim sachar kepinchas. But they look to get rewarded like Pinchas. In other words, they really are like Zimri, but on the outside they look like they're Pinchas, and they say, "Oh, give me all these rewards." And those are the hypocrites. Those are the people you have to the most fear. So again, as a review of this section, what we really did today was, number one, we finished that section on which was the seventh explanation of the Rasha Arum. And then we went to the other two statements of Rabbi Yehoshua of what an isha prusha is and what a makot perushim are. And we talked about other people that are similar to those kind of people. where again, it's this idea of looking one way, but really being something else entirely. And again, this fear that they were worried about people, whether it's sorcery or whether it's, seduction or whether it's all sorts of other things of trick people who were basically trying to trick people in the community. Now we get to a new Mishnah, which I saw interestingly on the WhatsApp groups yesterday, a lot of questions about this. Didn't address them because they come up explicitly in today's daf. So here you go. Rabbi Shimon Omer, we actually made reference to this earlier, and we're going to see it again now. Rabbi Shimon Omer, if you remember in the previous Mishnah, we said the schut is tolala, which caused all these questions. If she has merits, she's not going to die right away from the Sotah waters, which kind of broke everything we always thought. We're trying to figure out, is this woman good or not good? You expect her to die right away in the temple, and then and if she doesn't die, she's obviously innocent. But what happens? Comes this idea that the merits can push off the death, which means that we don't know when she walks out of the court, the Beit HaMikdash, is she guilty, is she not? And then what do? Does she go back with her husband? Right? So the truth is she goes back with her husband. But we're going to see, why are you saying no, Becky? She doesn't go back with her husband? Oh, okay. Okay, so now Rabbi Shimon says, you have to watch your movements, tricks, pushes me off. Rabbi Shimon Omer, and schut tola b'mayim hamarim. He says, no way, no, how does this work? The merits don't push anything off. No, she dies right away if she's guilty, and she doesn't if not. Because he basically says what I saw everybody worried about yesterday, which is, if you say the schut is tola in these waters, number one, you're going to weaken the power of these waters. What does that mean, to weaken the power? Well, the whole idea, I said we get back to this, is that we want the woman to be scared of these waters. We want her to have this image, I'm going to drink the water and my body is going to explode. Now, if you say that if you have merits, it'll push off the death, well, she'll say, Now, why do you want her, by the way, to be fearful of it? Because you want her to come up and admit and confess, and then we don't have to go through the whole ceremony, which is what the goal is. The goal is not to do the ceremony. The goal is that the ceremony is looming over your head and scaring you into confessing if you're really guilty. So if you know that you won't die right away because you know you're a good person otherwise, and you've done some good deeds in your life, so you'll say, fine, I'll die in 3 years. It just weakens the whole idea. If you have, it's like they say about children, you have to punish them immediately. If you punish them 5 days later, it already loses it. So you're going to weaken the whole fear that we want to instill in this woman about drinking those waters. And number two, that's for the guilty women. What about the women who aren't guilty? And this is obviously the other problem. You're going to make a bad name for all these women who drank and are actually innocent. People will say, oh, you didn't just prove your innocence because maybe you're guilty, and your merits are basically pushing it off. So that's Rabbi Shimon, who basically disagrees with this whole thing. Rebbi Omer, now Rebbi says, and we actually saw this, so for those who were concerned before might not remember this, but we talked about this. The schut is tola, but what? First of all, the Torah says, if you drink the waters and you're innocent, then you immediately get pregnant. Okay, now again, you have to take this literally, again, assuming this never really happened. It's all miraculous, this whole thing. So you're going to get pregnant right away. Now, if you're guilty, you will not get pregnant right away. So at least in 3 months, we'll know, are you pregnant or you're not pregnant? And not only that, but you don't start to look more beautiful, whereas if you do, you become more beautiful. And if you were innocent, your body slowly starts to deteriorate. So you'll already see signs. And that's why if you're innocent and you get pregnant and you start looking more beautiful, everyone will know that you're innocent. So there's other signs. You might not die right away, but they'll know whether you're guilty. There'll be outside signs that are indicative. This is interesting because we've been talking about the outside and the inside. There are these outside signs which will indicate, but I always think of the picture of Dorian Gray here, right? And the whole idea there in that book. Anyway, but your outside appearance will show what's going on, and whether you're guilty or not. And Laself, so she'll slowly deteriorate, and in the end, she'll die like the Sotah dies. Okay, last line for today. Now we're switching topics. We're going back to the meal offering. What if the meal offerings, if you remember, they brought it in a regular vessel and then they put it into a sanctified vessel? When it's before in the regular vessel, it's kedushat damim. It's sanctified for its value. Once you put in a klei sharet, it's got sanctity of kedushat haguf. It itself is sanctified. So there's always a difference between if the value is sanctified or it itself is sanctified. So we're now going to talk about what if it becomes impure at the different stages. So nitmeik minchata ad shelo kichabakli. If you didn't get sanctified in the vessel, put it in the sanctified vessel. It's like any other meal offering, and at that stage, you just redeem it. So the dough can be used for something else as soon as you redeem it onto money. The money takes the sanctity, and the dough is not sanctified anymore. It can be eaten by anybody. But once it was in the sanctified kli, you can't redeem it anymore. Anything that's k'shad guf can't be redeemed. And it has to be burned. Okay, not burned on the altar like as if it's sacrificed, but burn it, like destroy it. And then we're going to get to what are the other menachot that are in those. What are other cases in the Sotah story where you would have a mincha that gets burned that can't be brought, and we'll talk about that tomorrow. So, quick review. Again, we did the isha prusha, the makot perushim. We finished up that thing, the ula, before. I already reviewed that whole part. And then we talked about this famous machloka between Rabbi Shimon and Rebbi about whether skutolala or not, and all the issues that could be on both sides, and how Rabbi Shimon raises all sorts of good issues, and Rebbi tries to resolve them. And then what happens if the mincha gets impure? That's it for today. Wishing everyone a great day and almost a chodesh tov.